I'm Gerry Georgatos and welcome to Opinionated. Each week we will bring you one of the pressing issues of our times. Some say the ability to discover the truth is outstripped by the capacity to manifest deceit. Many argue that we are trapped within a narrow discourse, a corridor that many of us are corralled within. Opinionated hopes to challenge that discourse, political and otherwise. Today, our topic is money, the banking systems behind that money, the supranational bankers, the economical affairs of the world. Our guests are Dr. Abigail Bray, a senior researcher and author, heavily published and well-versed on the topic today. Similarly, so Colin Penter is well-versed, also a senior researcher, social scientist, and with a blog, prolific writer on neoliberalism, the challenges.
The love of money is the root of all evil. That stark warning contained in St. Paul's first letter to Timothy was at the heart of Pope Francis's homily at his morning mass in Santa Marta on Friday. Reflecting on the way in which greed can corrupt our hearts and weaken our faith, the Pope stressed we can never serve God and money at the same time.
Non puoi servire a Dio e al denaro, non si può.
Money, the Pope went on, sickens our minds, poisons our thoughts, even poisons our faith, leading us down the path of jealousy, quarrels, suspicion and conflict. While money begins by offering a sense of well-being, if we're not careful, wealth can quickly lead to vanity, self-importance and the sin of pride.
Sono tre scalini: la ricchezza, la vanità.
Pope Francis noted many people may object that the Ten Commandments say nothing about the evils of money. Yet when we worship money, he said, we are sinning against the first commandment and making money our idol in place of God.
Hanno 200, hanno 300.
The early fathers of the Church, he said, put it in a very blunt way, calling money the dung of the devil, which corrupts and leads us away from our faith.
Una parola forte, il denaro è lo sterco del diavolo. È così.
Instead of focusing on money, the Pope said, we should strive for justice, piety, faith and charity, as well as the gifts of patience and meekness, which are the ways of the Lord.
E ammala la nostra mente.
Pope Francis concluded with a wish that God will help each one of us to avoid falling into the trap of making money our idol.
Di questioni oziose. E ti allunga dalla fede, corrompe.
There's a long narrative here of the oppressor and the oppressed, of powerful elites, arguably running the economical affairs of the world, having impact on the daily lives of us as individuals. Humanity, many argue, is indentured, at least in the Western world, to 48-week years working. Are supranational bankers, are powerful elites really behind the huge and significant decisions made theoretically by government that impact upon our lives? Are there these shadowy, powerful elites?
I think this question has been circulating since 2008, when the global financial crisis happened. And rather than, framing that concern as a conspiracy, there's a lot of evidence, isn't there, that this is actually happening. And in fact, in 1913, one of the presidents of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, when he signed into existence the Federal Reserve Bank, lamented quite pathetically, I think, that he'd actually destroyed...
Post his tenure, post his presidential tenure.
Did he? Right, yes. Well, that's convenient. But he announced, basically, that he destroyed American democracy in 1913, that now a secret private elite, financial elite, were going to control the government. So if we take his warning, his confession, seriously, that means the American democracy has been effectively dead for a century. So, anyway.
Thomas Jefferson, if we go even a century earlier, argued that bankers are more powerful than standing armies. Roosevelt, Kennedy, Eisenhower all expressed their concern about these so-called secret societies and these powerful elites that have taken over the economic, political, military, industrial capital and had combined them as a vast resource and had worked effectively extrajudicially without any legislation to oversight them, and were working behind the scenes with the government effectively behind the government. and unknown to the government that was elected by the people. But can you, Colin, tell us a little bit in your view of what we've just said about these powerful private elites?
Well, listen, it's as Abigail said, it's a really important question, and it can be dismissed as conspiracy, but we've got good empirical evidence for it, Gerry. I mean, the New Scientist, which is for those who know science, is a highly reputable journal, published a study in 2012 by scientists from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. And what they did was that they looked at a database of 37 million companies. They identified 4,700 of those corporations, and then they used mathematical and computer models to analyse share ownership and revenues. And what they found was that there are a core of 147 corporations. Not all banks, but primarily banks, financial institutions and private investment institutions. So 147 of these they call it a super entity of corporations who primarily dominate the global economy. So it's not just conspiracy theory, there's actually evidence that confirms it.
Okay, when you talk about investment banks and commercial banks, in 1933, the Glass-Steagall legislation was crafted to separate commercial and investment banks. Investment banks theoretically dealing with the top end of town, high venture speculation and effective gambling for high turnover results, as opposed to commercial banks, which presumably should be conservative with the ordinary citizens' monies. That Glass-Steagall legislation, which was put in place to separate those two from the speculative powers that many banks actually indulge in, and investment companies and other financial institutions, had been watered down over the decades and was repealed by the Clinton administration. Do you have any view on that presumed protective factor as having, like some have said, contributed to the global financial crisis?
We were talking about this before, weren't we, Colin?
Yeah.
So,
I know a little bit about Glass-Steagall. I can't say I'm that well informed about it, but my understanding is that the repeal of it and the impact of that over time, and then the creation of a whole series of dodgy financial instruments, which were significant factors in the crisis of 2008 and the subsequent fallout from that, which we're still seeing. So my understanding is that Glass-Steagall was one of those factors that is recognised as contributing to the events that unfolded in 2008.
The repeal of Glass-Steagall.
The repeal of the Act, correct. And as you pointed out, primarily in the US, where the 2008 crisis originated.
Some argue that that's a smokescreen, that decisions made by Federal Reserves, by the central banks, were still in the interest of the central banks, and we had financial crisis during Glass-Steagall, post the Depression. So could we really argue that there's any protective factor that we can craft that would protect the ordinary citizen from shareholder loss, from financial institutions such as banks collapsing, when we've seen that, for instance, Glass-Steagall arguably did not protect them during the period of the... Is there any protective factor that we can put in place?
Well, I guess you just have to look at Australia and to look at the number of crises, scandals that have consumed ordinary working people, be it pensioners, be it superannuates, be it people seeking financial advice, where their life savings have been plundered by the banks, by financial institutions and by financial advisors. We've had scandal after scandal.
When you're saying plundered, are you basically imputing or describing banks, financial institutions as ruthless robber barons?
Well, I think part of the discussion we'll have tonight, of course, is about the model of capitalism that's evolved, and the model of capitalism that has evolved in the contemporary context is of corporations that do plunder. Not all of them, but there is a plundering feature to the way many of these global multinational and Australian corporations operate. No doubt about that.
For the sake of our audience, let's talk a little bit about banks and let's concentrate on central banks.
Yep.
So, for instance, the Reserve Bank, the major banks, the suppliers of the nation's money. Banks, central banks supply the nation's money and also determine interest rates and regulate effectively the value of currency because they determine how much money can be supplied at any one time. What's your view on the central banks themselves and their capacity?
Well, they're private corporations, which is something a lot of people don't understand. There's this assumption they're part of the government, they probably control the government. But yeah, they're private corporations. I think that's really important.
All major banks are private corporations?
Yeah. And some of them are veiled by intense secrecy laws. The Bank of England, for example, is a very, very secretive bank. It's the second oldest bank in the world and the model for most banks. And it's got a section called the Bank of England Nominees where Elizabeth Windsor, otherwise known as the Queen of Australia, hides her assets. Nobody knows how much she's worth, although she owns a sixth of the world. And so, yeah, there's a massive secrecy around the whole banking system. I think that's really important to recognise.
Well, on that note, you're talking about the hiding of assets.
Yeah.
Many good economists have actually estimated that possibly 2/3 of the world's printed money are now in tax havens. How do we reconcile that?
That's really interesting because I was looking at the Financial Secrecy Index from 2013 and Britain was at the top of that. They are in control of most of the world's tax havens. So, yeah.
I didn't know that. So Great Britain itself...
We think of it, officially there's Switzerland at the top, but if you add up, you know, the British territories that are tax havens, then England goes right up to the top.
So how's it possible that we live in this world where we've actually allowed, and especially when we're heading towards well, you haven't allowed it, but we're heading towards a central banking system. We're heading towards a central bank effectively. How is it possible that we actually have legislation that permits tax havens and that possibly 2/3 of the world...
Well, legislation can be bought.
Or disregarded? Or disregarded.
Well, you just have to see, Gerry. I mean, we've had the Senate inquiry here into this very issue that Sam Dastyari has been pursuing, and they've just handed down their interim report. And you know, it's been interesting to see the forces lining up against, you know, what are pretty much conservative recommendations to put a. I mean, I think it was the Senate found that 60% of the top 200 Australian companies use tax havens. So, you know, Australian corporations, some of the biggest corporations are using offshore account, tax havens and shell companies to conceal and avoid
I'll ask
their
one
tax
question because
responsibilities.
we're about to wrap up to go to the next segment. And importantly, what do you describe are powerful influences, powerful elites? And we know Senate commissions and inquiries and royal commissions go nowhere. What hope do we have? In a nutshell, what hope do we actually have to take them on?
I think there should be mass class actions against banks all across the world. And I think we need to increase the safety for whistleblowers. So,
well, the Obama administration has prosecuted more whistleblowers than any other administration in American history. I think we have to have many discussions on this, but as it's a wrap-up, we'll be heading to a commercial break and coming back with our crossover guest.